Okay.
So each of you, tell me your name and, oh, and the other thing is, don't look at Wendy, look at me. Tell me your name and how long you've lived in Hampton Falls and a little bit of how you came to Hampton Falls. And you can take turns if you want.
Okay. Well, my name's Peter Wagner, and my parents moved here in 1954 from Natick, Massachusetts. So they bought Applecrest at that time, and I lived in Applecrest for the remaining of my years so far. I moved with Peter, with my parents in '54. Lived in Hampton Falls while I was going to school and so forth. After I was through with the military and at the end of my schooling, my wife and I moved in various parts of the country. We came back to Hampton Falls. I worked at Applecrest from 1979 till 2005. So that's my
I don't think you caught your name.
I'm sorry. My name is Ben Wagner. I'm Peter's brother.
What brought your parents to Hampton Falls from Natick? I mean, what intrigued them with the farming business?
Well, my understanding is that my father was working in Lawrence at the time, and he was in personnel work, and 128 was being built at the time, and 128 was a forever project. It took years and years. He commuted, and when the commute finally became intolerable, my parents decided they would move closer to Lawrence. And in doing so, they went to a realtor in Exeter. I wish I could think of his name, but he said, we have a lovely house. You have a big house to handle your family. Why don't you take a look at it? By the way, it does have some acreage and some apple trees on it. My father was a fourth generation New Yorker, and I'm not sure he knew what an apple tree looked like. So that's where we started from. And from that time on, a number of employees came with the farm. Peter can get into that because some are still employed. And that's extraordinary. I just can't believe every time I see Gert Eaton and Evelyn, they've been here since before 1954, so they've been here a very long time. So that's how my parents got here. They went to UNH, the horticultural school, to find out about growing apples, and with the help of certainly the Eatons and the Youngs and the other employees, they learned about growing apples, and that was 1954.
Well, you were both young boys when you came here. What was your feelings about moving from a place like Natick to a small blue-collar town like Hampton Falls?
Well, I was 10 years old and really didn't have much of an impact, probably more so or less so than Ben or my sister, A.L. And I think the one thing I remember moving to Hampton Falls was that back then you had the little school, Lincoln Ackerman, that was basically a little bit more than a one-room schoolhouse. We had one teacher for two classes. The first and second grades were together. The third and fourth grades were together, and fifth and sixth grades were together. So that was a unique experience, kind of a fun experience. I think there were like 10 students in my class, and now look at it, and it's almost like a metropolis. My recollection, I was in the 7th grade, and at the time, once you got to the 7th grade, you had some choices to make. If you happen to live on this side of Hampton Falls, or on Route 88, you tended to go to Exeter. If you lived close to Route 1, you went to Hampton. We also had the option of going to Amesbury and going to Newburyport. But as I say, it was pretty much where you lived. And there was a bus. The Kents lived across the street, Gloria and Herbie, and of course, Gwendolyn, whose father was Walter B. Farmer, who started Applecrest. And Herbie was very prominent the town of Exeter with the bank and the mill. And he would drive Gloria and my sister, and Lyndon Peter, my sister, to school in the morning. And I was in the 7th grade, and my sister was in the 9th. She was a freshman. That was her first year at Robinson Seminary, which at a later time, within a year or so, merged with the boys' side of the high school, and they were merged at that point. But Herbie Kent, started driving all of us into school in the morning, so that was kind of neat. And then the school, of course, during the rest of the year, we would take the school bus in.
So, talk a little bit about, as children, how did you come to start really working and managing the farm? How did that?
Well, that's an interesting evolution. I never worked at the farm in the summers. Never imagined I'd come back. I went to college. Then I went to graduate school in business, got my MBA, and then went into service for 4.5 years. And it was after the military, before that, after graduate school, I worked at Eastman Kodak in Rochester, New York. And I even at that point, never intended coming back to the farm. We were stationed in Germany once. I got a phone call from my mother and father, and they said that they were thinking of what to do with the farm, whether or not we'd be interested in coming back. I'm sure Ben received the same phone call. I'm sure my sister received the same phone call. And at that point, I said, well, I've never thought about it. And then I went overseas again to Asia, and when I came back, before I went, I think I made a decision at that point that I was going to come back. I didn't feel like I wanted to be a corporate guy working at Eastman Kodak. I wanted to be my own boss. And there were, obviously, coming back to the farm, down deep was something a lot of people, it's never out of your system. You think it is, but you never lose it. And I think the more I thought about it, the more attractive it seemed. And my wife, Linda, at that point we had 2 children, seemed to really like the idea. So it was more a process of evolution rather than a real decision. And never once did I ever think in high school or college that I was coming back to the farm.
About you, Ben?
My path was not much different. I worked summers. It was a great place to work summers. It was outside physical work, which I was looking for. It was a nice change from the academic world. So that was a big plus. So I jumped at the opportunity to spend the summers here. When I got through the military, went to graduate school, I had got a phone call from my parents, as Peter did. Dad was wondering whether or not, what
Okay.
Are we ready?
I think we're ready.
Did we need Peter to state his name for the camera? Where
Oh,
else
sure.
have
Let's
we
do
got?
it anyway.
Why don't we
just to
do
show.
that? Just tell me who you are and what your role is here at the orchard.
Right. I'm Pete Wagner, president and owner of Applecrest Farm Orchards.
Does that sound
Perfect.
good?
Yep.
Okay. So let's go back to these talking points, Peter. The farm dates back to 1913, and the existing barn goes back 100 years prior to that. Tell us what you know about the property at that time in the early 1900s, and what are your personal favorite memories of the farm, the barn, and your parents' house? So just talk about that. Talk about your childhood.
Sure. Applecrest Farm, as an apple orchard, started really as a chicken farm in 1913. Sure, it was a farm before that, as most properties back in the 1800s started as vegetable farms, dairy farms. But it started as a apple farm first, as a chicken farm, by Walter B. Farmer, who came from Colorado. He was a geologist, and he came from there. His family lived around the area. Came back to New Hampshire, saw the property, and said, "Hey, this is a perfect place to have an apple orchard." And because back then the apple orchards, it took 10, 12 years for standard trees to even start producing apples. He said, "Okay, what can I do to make money in the meantime?" So he said, "Okay, I'm going to be a chicken farmer." So if you look at the old-time photographs of Applecrest in the early 1900s, you see these stone wall features that we still have. If you walk around the orchard in the back of where we are now, these beautiful stone walls that were chicken coops. So all the old photographs had chicken coops all around the roads, and these little small apple trees planted all around. And you could see that they're starting to develop the apple orchard and from the chicken. So that's, you look at the old time photographs, and that's what you're seeing. You're seeing wagons drawn by horses, and every now and then you might see a tractor, an old tractor that was built in the early 1900s. Some of the first machinery that probably existed in Hampton Falls were here. In fact, the trees that we see right now behind me in this whole orchard, this is one of the original orchards. This orchard was planted again in 1913. It's probably one of the oldest trees, commercial orchards in the state. I mean, that's over 100 years old for an apple tree, and that's a long time. So, and I have to cut it out because really it's time to move on, but I'm really reluctant because they hold a very special place in my heart. I don't want to cut down these old trees. The trunks are huge. The trunks are like this, and you can just tell how big these, and yeah, they're special trees. But they're going to have to come out sometime.
Why is that? Why do they have to come out?
They have to come out because new varieties have come along that are more, not just new varieties of different kinds of varieties, but new strains of McIntosh have come out and have been developed that are better tasting McIntosh, easier to take care of. Their trees are smaller, you get more production. And to have a big tree, if you notice, we've cut the tops of these trees down. We've done that because we can't possibly maintain, it costs too much to maintain a big tree. And the only reason why these trees are profitable is that this was one of my pick-your-own orchards. And the people love to walk around, and I can pay for it because the pick-your-own price is where it is, and so that helps me. But economically, it does not make, I could never make money if this was a commercial wholesale operation. So it's got to be a pick-your-own. And it's time, you see a lot of empty spots, empty spaces, and it's time to take them out.
When did the pick your own start? Was that, did your father do that, or was that something that you did with?
No, as a matter of fact, it goes back.
So start with pick your own.
Yeah, with pick your own, which is part of this new concept of agritourism, and that's important because we can talk about that at a later time. But agritourism. Applecrest had one of the first aspects of agritourism in an apple train that went from Boston, Walter B. Farmer back in the 20s, all the way through possibly the 30s and even maybe the 40s, and I'm not sure because the only way I know about the apple train is that we have copies of the ad that he placed in the Boston Globe, and it talked about an apple train that he brought people from Boston up to the railroad tracks in the depot by the marsh, and they dropped them off there, and he picked them up in his wagon, and brought them to the apple orchard to pick apples. I've been trying to find more information, what it costs, what they were charging, but I do know he advertised specially wormless apples. That was the special. That's what made Applecrest apples so special. Wormless apples. And he actually showed an apple with a worm in it and said, "We have no worms in our apples." Of course, back then you had maggot, and that's a very, very prevalent pest. And even in today's commercial operation or any kind of operation, it's a pest you have to deal with. And back then it was very hard to take care of. So this train bring people from the Boston market up to Applecrest was, he was living in a different world. I mean, nobody did that. That was thinking outside the envelope, no question about it. And I think Applecrest has always taken that clue, and we have always thought outside the envelope. My mother, I think anyways, started pick your own before anybody did, by using pick your own drops. We had people back in the 50s when my mom and dad first bought the farm in '54. We advertised pick your own drops, and that's how the whole pick your own started. Then in the 70s, when the commercial wholesale fruit market, apple market, just went under, we thought again outside the envelope. Okay, how can we make this farm work? We started the pick your own operation. So it was basically in the late 60s, early 70s that pick your own at Applecrest started. And that's been a major part of our business. So I could honestly say that Mom and Dad were the first, one of the first ones to have a pick your own program. It started small, but it's now a pretty big aspect of our operation.
What a great answer.
Okay.
Talk about your earliest memories of moving here and moving into the house.
You know, when Mom and Dad bought the farm, my mom was a farmer's daughter, upstate New York, up by Cayuga Lake, off the shores of Cayuga Lake, and her father was a farmer, a real dirt farmer. She, when I, as a young child, I remember visiting him. Even would have been back in '48, somewhere around there. He still had horses and plowing by horses, and that's how he had a mule, two horses, and that's how Mom grew up. My dad, on the other hand, was from the city. He was a third-generation New York City boy. Never saw anything grow. Didn't know an apple grew on trees. Didn't know when they grew. And they met through a mutual friend. And Dad, at that point, had been working for General Electric and Human Resources Department. He was a vice president with them. And at that point, moved to Massachusetts in Natick. And lived there until 1954, when the town came in and said they were going to cut down by eminent domain this beautiful, huge elm tree right on their property. It was on the corner. They had to widen the road. And my dad said, "No, you're not." And they fought, and obviously the town won, and Dad said, "That's it, I'm leaving." I think he was the first commuter. Back in '54, he said, "That's it, I'm moving to New Hampshire, and I'll commute back and forth." Mom saw the house. That house was built in 1813, I think. Fell in love with the house. Obviously, it came with hundreds of acres, and they weren't even thinking about growing apples or farming it. They said, "We'll just buy the farm, and we'll worry about the apples later." And Dad was just going to commute back and forth to work, which he did for several years. Dad and Mom fell in love with the whole process of growing apples. And not knowing much about growing, they both went to UNH. They were 50 years old. They went to UNH Extension. They spent 2 years in agricultural school to learn about growing apples, and that's how they got into it. Not just through happenstance, you know. It's just something that they had no intention of ever doing, but they fell in love with it, and they've had many bad years doing that, though. So my first recollection, is Hurricane Carol, 1954. 2 hurricanes back to back, Carol and Diane. Mom and Dad bought the farm with a crop, a full crop. Moved in, signed the papers, moved in 2 days before, well, actually, part of us moved in 2 days before a hurricane, but the truck actually moved the day the hurricane struck. So my recollection is getting all the furniture into the house just before the hurricane, having the hurricane hit, having no lights, and sleeping downstairs in the living room because we had no place, because no lights were on. We had no idea where our rooms were, so we just fell down and fell asleep. And that was my first recollection of apple cress. And of course, we woke up the next day, and apple trees were uprooted. All of Colburn, all of that Colburn orchard, where the houses are now, every one of those trees were laid down. Not only did we lose the whole crop, but half the trees, maybe even 3/4 of the trees, were on the ground, and we had to upright them. It was a job. It was a mess, and it took several years to recover from that. And then, of course, you had one hurricane after another, and a lot of money into the farm. It was a struggle. Mom and Dad had a lot of struggles, lost a lot of crops, but they persevered to the present.
Tell me about your,
You know,
and just started
growing
as a child.
growing up as a children of any kind of farmer, obviously you are expected to work in the orchards. Summer, they never really forced us. We never really said, we had chores, but we had typical chores. You had to mow the grass. You had all the shoveling snow during the snow. That was a typical thing that every kid back then had to do. Never got paid for it. That was not, you don't get paid for doing that stuff. You had your chores, taking the garbage out and stuff like that. Mom and Dad never ever forced us or said you have to work on the farm. This was their choice. They made the choice. We were, all 3 children, very active in school, sports, very active after school, and all the way through high school. In the summer, we worked. In the summer, we did work on the farm. But we also were able, I remember one summer where I took off and worked for the summer in a logging camp in Canada. My dad and Mom wanted to diversify, wanted to make sure we explored all the avenues of life. They didn't want us growing up with apple crest on our backs, the pressure of coming back to the farm. And never ever were we expected to come back to the farm. And as a result, none of us came back until we were quite old, in our 20s and in some cases 30s. It was none of that pressure that, you have to keep the farm going. It was their thing. They were willing to sell it whenever they got tired of it. In fact, that's one reason why I did come back, because they did say, Peter, if you boys don't want the farm, and it's fine with us, we're going to sell it. At that point, my brother was working for IBM, and I'm trying to figure out where I had just come back from Vietnam, and I had a job at Eastman Kodak where I had previously worked before I went into service, and it was only after that I decided, Linda and I decided that this might not be a bad life. But at no time did I ever think I'd be back here. Wasn't even growing up, going to college, I never thought I'd have a life like this.
A little bit about the conservation easement and what that meant to what the town support meant for the future of the farm, or the stability of the farm.
The background of the conservation easement, it's fairly complicated, but I can simplify it by saying most farms, the biggest pressure and obstacle for a farm to continue from one generation to another generation is the death tax, is the fact that farms don't make a lot of money, so there's not a cash reserve for one generation to buy the other generation out. And so as a result, most farms don't get passed down because they have to be sold to pay the death tax, or the older generation needs to sell it so they can retire and live on that money that the land. It's land rich and cash poor situation, and we were no different. So when my mom passed away in 2003, the children, my sister Yael and my brother Ben and myself, at that point, brother Ben was working with me. They came to the conclusion that they wanted to sell the farm, that they didn't want it. Yael wasn't part of the farm. She was had a family in Portland, Maine. So she said, look, buy me out or I'm out of here. Somehow we got to figure this thing out. At that point, my brother also, he was tired of farming, and we've had a lot of pressure, and I was the only one who really wanted to keep the farm going. I didn't want to retire. So we had to think outside the envelope, a very creative way of how I could get enough money to buy my brother and sister out. At that point, we had several developers interested in the property, and developing the land would not have, we were right in the middle of the high prices of houses, peak building period. We had many offers, and we wouldn't have any trouble selling it for what it was worth. But I still didn't want to sell. I was at that point I was 65, 62, and I just said no. I don't want to sell. And they basically said, well, you know what? You have to come up with the cash. So how would I come up with the cash? Well, I sold some pieces of land, but the primary reason I was able to afford it was because of the conservation easement that I bought in conjunction with the town through the federal government, the farm and ranch grants that allowed me to get the development value for the land, pay off my siblings, and continue running the orchard. I basically sold the development rights. So what you're seeing here is basically outside of 10 acres. I would not be able to develop any of this. It's got to remain undeveloped. I can use it for agricultural reasons, I can use it any way I want, but I cannot develop it. And it works. And it works. I think it works for the town, and it works for us.
Just one more statement, Peter. Just say that the land can't be developed in perpetuity or forever. Just clarify that.
And in regard to the conservationism and the development aspect of it, this land, this beautiful land that we have outside of the 10 acres that we have where the retail store is, where the new retail store is going to be, the house, we have 10 acres there that is excluded with the conservation easement. Other than those 10 acres, this whole land will never ever in perpetuity be able to be developed. It will have to remain exactly the way you see it for the rest of time, which is kind of nice, isn't it? And the town allowed that to happen because the people, through, I would say, some significant effort by certain individuals, I'm not sure I'm allowed to name names, but it's the truth, who just, without them, and I'm forever indebted to them. And I think the town should be forever, because it wasn't a hard, it was a hard sell for those people that saw the need for it. It wasn't a hard sell, but for a lot of people, I think maybe even today, a lot of people may say, what the heck are we doing that for? But as you can see, this is pretty special now, and it will continue to be special. It's interesting because this summer, I just got finished purchasing another 10 acres that are enveloping the church along Brown Road and Route 88 that used to belong to Dr. Bailey. And we did that to protect our parking and so forth. And I'm now, hopefully, to pay for that, I need to get another easement because it's an expensive parking lot right now.
Great answer. Great answer. And how that started. And the fact that some of them have been
the
here
way,
for so long.
yeah, pickers. How do we handle the labor of working, picking, harvesting all the crops we have at Applecrest? We started in '54 as an apple farm. Before that time, it was an apple farm through Walter B. Farmer, Major Platts, and my dad came on the scene, and we used at that point migrant workers who would start in Florida and follow the maturity of the crops from Florida, picking whatever crops were available, and usually be apples, but it would start as sugar cane in Florida and work their way up the seaboard, and everything would be timed so perfectly that by the time our apples would be ready to pick, they would be showing up at our doorstep. So it started off as migrant workers, where they would come in with a crew boss, a chef, no families, just a whole group of men, and that would be our pickers. During the war, that slowed down a little bit, and in the early 50s, the migration, the use of migrating workers sort of dissipated. And there was a short period of time where we had no workers. So for 2-3 years, we used the Air Force people from Pease Air Force Base. And they were a great help because there were a lot of men ready to work and wanting to work. So we were able to pick in a couple years using local, so-called local people, which was a zoo. They weren't good. They weren't. Some were great and some were pretty poor. They bruised the fruit, but back then bruising was not as important as it is today. Then we brought in some Nova Scotians. We brought in Nova Scotians for a couple years. The apple industry could not survive without, well, let's put it this way. We formed an organization called the New England Apple Council because we realized that we couldn't rely on local, we couldn't rely on Nova Scotians. It was getting hard. They were getting harder and harder to bring into the country. The government was sort of looking not very kindly on that. So we said, what can we do? At that point, Jamaicans, the West Indies Labor Council, which included Jamaica and surrounding islands, they also formed a coalition. And our coalition got involved with the Jamaican government. We presented our case to the U.S. government, and the Jamaican labor force was developed through what we call the H-2A program, which is basically a registered organization whereby we use legal, or I should say we use Jamaicans who are legally allowed into the country with special papers. We put them in barracks. They're like family to us. They've been like family to us. We have the same people here that I can remember when they know me when I was a kid. I have a 72-year-old working, who's worked here for close to 45 years. And we have many. They are like family, and I think they're also like family members to a lot of people in this community. I think everybody respects them. We respect each other. They spend a lot of money in the community. They buy many of their housewares that they bring back to Jamaica. They buy in the local community. So it works. It's a great relationship, and it works for both of us. Obviously, without the Jamaicans, we'd be out of business. No question about it. We would be absolutely out of business. And the interesting thing about that, I'm talking about the present, I know this is history, it's getting harder and harder to get these men. The government is really restricting the use of the H-2A program, which is too bad, but that's neither here nor there.
You gave us a great quote that without them we'd be out of business. We will. Is there any? I do want you to make the statement about the apple orchard about Applecrest being one of the oldest and largest continuously operating apple orchards in the country. But before we do that, is there anything that we haven't asked you that you feel is important that you want to communicate? Remember, we're undertaking this project with an eye to the future. With what would your grandson or your granddaughter want to know about how Hampton Falls has evolved?
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you think is important?
No, I think we've covered it.
Okay.
I think we've covered it. Yeah.
So can we get that? Can we get
Sure.
the statement?
Yeah. Going back to the when the farm started developing the farm as an apple orchard back in 1913, there weren't that many apple orchards. There were some in the late 1800s, but they've been out of business for a while. But going back, checking our records, we have talked to some historians, and after doing some research, they have determined, and it's quite an honor, and it's a small town, Hampton Falls, a small town in Hampshire, I should say, Hampton Falls, and we have been recognized as being one of the oldest, largest, continuously run apple orchards in the country. And that says an awful lot. I mean, it just doesn't, with all the farms going out of business now, and to be able to continually run an apple orchard that many years, it's over 100. I mean, we're, as you can see, 100 years. So yeah, it's so I think it's safe to say that we do have that quote.
Great.